Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to our first literary event of 2026. Sorry that we're starting late, but we have a fabulous problem, which is that we were totally sold out and we were putting out more chairs, and we now don't have any place to put more chairs. So I was wondering if you could raise your hand if you have an empty seat next to you so we can place people. Okay, so the ushers are looking. Just keep your hand up for a moment so they know where there's some extra seats. Fabulous. Thank you. Okay. So tonight's program is part of our long-standing literary series called Some Favorite Writers, which is an ongoing collaboration between the Hammer Museum and the UCLA Department of English, and it's curated by the wonderful novelist and UCLA professor Mona Simpson. Mona is the best-selling author of Anywhere But Here, The Lost Father, A Regular Guy, Off Keck Road, My Hollywood, Casebook, and Commitment, and as of 2020, she's also the publisher of the Paris Review. And tonight, Mona has brought us the fabulous writer Jean Strouse to talk about her new book, Family Romance, John Singer Sargent and the Wertheimers. This book is especially significant for us at the Hammer because one of the jewels of the Hammer Museum's collection is the John Singer Sargent painting of the French gynecologist and art collector Samuel Jean de Pozy. Our Dr. Pozy has been on a world tour for the past year or so and is most recently on view in the Sargent exhibition at the Met in New York. But he'll be home and on view here at the Hammer in 5 days on January 27th. So please do come back and pay him a visit. And now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our host, Mona Simpson.
Thank you for coming and good evening. Welcome. Those of you who are regulars to this series know that we usually invite fiction writers. I confess I read novels and short stories and poems much more than I read books of reportage or biographies or even essays. So for a nonfiction writer to come to our UCLA Hammer series, she or he has to be extraordinary, which only begins to describe Jean Strouse. Virginia Woolf famously speculated in a room of one's own, what would have happened if Shakespeare had had an extremely talented sister? Well, Jean Strouse taught us in her first splendid book of cultural history that Henry James and William James did have a gifted sister, Alice, whose life we can more fully understand this extraordinary family of American intellectuals and no-goodniks, a history of neurotic troubles and a struggling woman whose lifetime intersected with that of Freud, but whose treatment was not benefited by his discoveries, which were not yet in practice. As Judith Thurman, the biographer of Dennison, once said about Jean Strouse's first and second books, Alice James was just waiting for somebody to find her, whereas J.P. Morgan posted no trespassing signs all over the place. Jean said in response that she had to work around him to create a narrative through his actions and through other people's voices. Don't you think, she asked, biographers often learn about their subjects through indirection, through things they didn't mean for us to find? You have to take them by surprise, reading the codes and all kinds of scattered evidence. A reviewer of Jean's second book, the 796-page Morgan, an American Financier, remarked that they were not a perfect couple. J. Pierpont Morgan, the inarticulate, unreflective, and unofficial central banker of the United States before there was a Federal Reserve, and Jean Strouse, a former Radcliffe English major, whose analytic gifts previously focused on a biography of Alice James, a powerless invalid. But for 15 years, Ms. Strouse has lived nearly full-time on paper and in her head with Morgan, the titan who gave birth to industrial America and many of New York's most important cultural institutions. She has pored over Morgan's ledger books, investigated his mistresses, and found pressed violets in the diary of his first wife. Ms. Strouse grew up here in Los Angeles, where her father was an internist, came to New York after graduating from Radcliffe in 1967 and worked as an assistant to Robert Silvers at the New York Review of Books. She left after a few years to work at Newsweek as a book reviewer and to write, and in 1975 began work on her 1980 Alice James book, which won the Bancroft Prize. She began working on Morgan in 1983. I've been living like a graduate student, and I've had it, she said in one interview when she finally finished. Her newest book, Family Romance, centers around the great painter John Singer Sargent and the British art dealer who commissioned him to paint his family members and donated 10 of the 12 paintings to the British state. Sargent became the British art merchant Asher Wertheimer becomes a full character in his own, and Sargent was so comfortable in their home that they eventually called the dining room Sargent's Mess. He became great friends with Asher's daughter, Ima, and their correspondence animates the story of his story, and Sargent, like Henry James, was another of these great Americans in the Gilded Age living in Europe. Jackson Arne said in The New Yorker of Family Romance, "I read and shivered and tried unsuccessfully to think of another sub-300-page work of nonfiction that deserves to be called an epic." So on that note, here we go with Jean. Thank you so much, and we'll have questions and answers afterwards.
Thank you, Mona, and thank everyone connected with the Hammer for organizing this event. I'm really impressed with how well you've publicized it and how well it's been organized, so heartfelt thanks. Okay. John Singer Sargent painted this portrait of Ina and Betty, daughters of Asher and Mrs. Wertheimer, in 1901. He posed them in the drawing room of the family's house on Connaught Place in London. Their father, Asher, was an eminent art dealer who filled the house with objects of his trade, old master paintings and fine works of decorative art. You can see frames of paintings on the wall behind the sisters, and the elder one, Ina, short for Helena, rests her left hand on the lid of a large Chinese vase. With her right arm around her sister's waist, she seems to be presenting Betty to the world like a doll. Sargent's technical skill and sense of play are in full effect here. He's showing off as he extends the long line of Betty's turned-out right arm with the downstroke of her open fan. A medical student at the time responded to public skepticism about this limb by photographing 20 arms and proving Betty's to be anatomically correct. While Sargent was finishing the painting in his studio in London, he showed it to a visiting American and asked, "What do you think of it?" What he himself thought came through in his questions as he went on a couple of minutes later. "Isn't it stunning of the taller girl? Don't you think she is handsome?" And a few minutes after that, "Isn't Miss Wertheimer beautiful?" She was indeed beautiful, 6 feet tall with masses of dark hair and a voluptuous figure. She was 23 when Sargent entered the Wertheimer family circle. He was 41. They remained such close friends over the following decades that Ina's husband wondered whether they'd been lovers. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Here is a Sargent self-portrait. Although he was admired for his sensory revelation of character and for, quote, dragging the truth out of a man's superficial personality, he had zero interest in revealing his own character and truth. He painted only 3 self-portraits, all on commission, and he looks guarded and remote in them all. Asher Wertheimer commissioned paintings of himself and his wife for their 25th wedding anniversary in 1897, and then 10 more of the couple's 10 children. Sargent did the younger Wertheimers singly and in groups. This huge commission of 12 portraits made Asher the artist's greatest private patron. Sargent mock complained to a friend as he worked on the series between 1898 and 1908 of being in a state of chronic Wertheimerism. He was by this time the leading portrait painter of transatlantic high society, and he was an American living in London. His parents had left Philadelphia for Europe in the early 1850s to cheer up Mrs. Sargent after the death of their, of their first baby, and stayed abroad for the rest of their lives. Have you not been able to hear me all along? Okay, this is better though. John was born in Florence in 1856, followed by two sisters. From early on, he proved to be a gifted musician as well as an immensely talented artist. The family traveled constantly throughout Europe. John became fluent in French, Italian, Spanish, and spoke some German, and did not set foot in America until he was 20. Still, he always considered himself American. When he was elected to the prestigious Royal Academy of Artists in London, he told another painter, "As to the question of my nationality, I have not been invited to retouch it, and I keep my twang," meaning his American accent. He turned down the offer of a knighthood in 1907, since it would have required him to give up his US citizenship. About that twang, I tried very hard to find recordings of his voice or video recordings of him, but there was nothing. I wondered what he sounded like. I mean, he was American, but he grew up all over Europe. His parents obviously spoke with American accents. I suspect it was sort of mid-Atlantic, what they sometimes call Connecticut British, but I don't know what he sounded like. The whole Sargent family moved to Paris in 1874 when John was 18, so he could study in the art capital of the world. He had tremendous early success in Paris. Inhaling the lessons of his teachers and the study of earlier masters, he quickly gained recognition. He did some of his most original work during these Paris years. In 1880, he was in Morocco, and here you see he was just knocked out by the dazzling sunlight in Morocco, and it took up the challenge of painting something that's almost all white and varieties of white. It's called Fumée d'ambergris, which means smoke of ambergris. And ambergris was thought to be an aphrodisiac. This woman is, as you see, she's holding the mantle of her shawl or cape over her head, and ambergris is burning in a censer at her feet so she can inhale the smoke. She's clearly a model. She's not wearing a veil or and her fingernails are painted and she has on makeup. So it's not a Moroccan woman, and it's somebody who's posing here, but the whites in this painting are just spectacular. Also, the Hammer's very own Dr. Pozzi, as you've heard. He was a very good friend of Sargent's and also in the circle around Proust. He's wearing a dressing gown looking like a sexy cardinal. He was gynecologist to the stars of the Parisian beau monde. One of his affairs was with Sarah Bernhardt, the actress, who called him Dr. God. I'm glad to know that he's on his way back. He was in New York at the Met for this show on Sargent in Paris, and then that has been at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris for the last few months. And then in 1884, he painted a portrait of another American in Paris that set off a hot scandal when shown at the prestigious Paris Salon. Just briefly, I'm going to talk about that. If you want to hear more, we can talk about it in the question period. She was from Louisiana. She married a French banker and was very much of a social climber, sort of a professional beauty, she was called, and probably also a sexual adventurer. She made herself up. You can see she's sort of powdered her skin a kind of lavender green, and she would rouge one ear. I don't know whether she rouged the other one too, because we can't see it. But Sargent was, people said to Sargent he didn't need to paint her because she painted herself. He was very struck by her appearance. It wasn't a commission. He wanted to paint her because he thought she was so interesting looking, and struggled with what he called her complete laziness and unpaintable beauty. And when the show opened in Paris, it was a complete scandal. It's hard to shock Paris, so it's a little puzzling as to why this created so much problem. One reason, one of the straps on her right shoulder was falling down, so that sort of suggested sexual libertinism. And also, I think some of it had to do with them both being Americans, sort of succeeding in Paris in some ways, Sargent more than Madame X. So after the exhibition closed, Sargent took the portrait back to his studio and repainted the strap in the upright position. There are photographs of it when it's down, but it doesn't make a big difference. 30 years later, he sold it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, telling the director, "I suppose it is the best thing I've done." It's really a star at the Met now. I mean, people make special trips just to see it, and they have a Halloween show every year, and many people dress up as Madame X. After this scandal, demand for Sargent's work dried up so completely that he thought of giving up painting and going into music or business. Music might have been a good idea, business, not so much. Friends urged him to move to England, which he slowly did, and stayed there for the rest of his life. Still, he was a kind of nomad, always eager to get out of the studio, travel, and paint in North Africa, the Middle East, all over Europe, and the US. One of his biographers said he was at home everywhere and belonged nowhere. Here is Sargent's painting of Asher Wertheimer, first shown at London's Royal Academy in 1898. Asher's father, Samson, had emigrated to England from Bavaria in 1839 to escape the severe restrictions placed on Jews by the German states. He was a gifted artisan in bronze who quickly rose to become one of England's leading art dealers. His clients included Rothschilds and the royal family. He left a substantial fortune when he died in 1892, about 386,000 pounds, which would be nearly $70 million today. Both of his sons, Asher and Charles, followed Samson into the art trade and did even better. One critic at the time compared this portrait to a Rembrandt. Another said, "Happy is the man whose portrait has been painted thus." However, it has been quite controversial for more than a century, serving as something of a cultural Rorschach test. Many people at the time and since have regarded it as anti-Semitic. Standing in the artist's studio, dressed in black, somehow it looks a little, his collar looks a little yellow there, but that's this slide, it really is white. But he seems to emerge from mysterious dark space. Light from above falls on his balding forehead, flushed cheeks, wet red lips, on the gleam of his gold watch chain, his left hand holding a cigar, and near his right knee, not so easy to see in the dark background, the lolling pink tongue of his black poodle named Noble. Asher looks energetic, confident, amused. He also looks unmistakably Jewish, and almost all the responses to the painting, positive and negative, have focused on the sitter's ethnicity. Here's a photograph of Asher, so you see what he looked like not in Sargent's hands, and then there's Sargent's rendering. An American who saw this painting in Sargent's studio said the art dealer looked as if he were pleasantly engaged in counting golden shekels. When 9 of the Wertheimer portraits were installed in London's National Gallery in 1923, a bequest from Asher, a committee in Parliament held a debate about them, and one member asked the chairman, can the right honorable gentleman manage that these clever but extremely repulsive pictures should be placed in a special chamber of horrors and not between the brilliant examples of the art of Turner? That Asher did not object to his portrayal, in fact, he went on to commission 10 more, it was not a given that he didn't object. He and his wife Flora did not like this companion painting of her. Her descendants say she thought it made her look too rich, draped as she is in lace and jewels, and Sargent painted her again 6 years later. There was a great deal of tragedy in this family. Is someone laughing? There she is in the first one, and here she is in the second one. There was a great deal of tragedy in this family, and by the time Sargent did this second portrait of Flora in 1904, the couple's 2 eldest sons had died in their 20s, which I think you see in this painting. When I first saw the Wertheimer portraits, they took me by surprise. I associated Sargent with paintings of European aristocrats and American elites, not with Jews. And I wondered, as I thought about writing this book, whether the artist had other Jewish subjects and friends. As I got into this story, I learned that the answer was yes. He had close friendships with many other prominent Jewish individuals and families whom he also painted. In all, he did around 1,300 portraits in oil or charcoal. About 70 of those depicted Jews, roughly 5%, although he portrayed several of them more than once, which makes the percentage even smaller. Still, portraits had historically been markers of privilege, featuring royals, aristocrats, prominent figures in the military and the church. That the leading chronicler of high society would choose to do so many Jewish subjects was striking enough to elicit comments. His portrait of Lady Sassoon, who was born a French Rothschild, was shown at the Royal Academy in 1907, and one of the visitors, who was a poet who actually knew Sargent, said to his companion, "Sargent paints nothing but Jews and Jewesses now, and says he prefers them as they have so much more life and movement than our English women." Cynics said he did it for the money, although by this time so many people were clamoring for portraits that he was trying to cut back. He was always drawn to people and cultures other than his own. What fired his imagination was visual drama, which he found in the Moroccan model, in Spanish dancers, Arab nomads, Dr. Pozzi, Madame X, and he found it in Jews. Now, of course, he would be charged with Orientalism. It may be hard to fathom in the cosmopolitan cultures of the 21st century how alien, exotic, and other Jews looked to Anglo-Saxon eyes in the late 19th century. They were frequently characterized, in fact, as Oriental, which completely took me by surprise. I'd never heard that. Oriental meaning not familiar, not Western, not us. In describing this portrait of the 3 youngest Wertheimer children, Essie, Ruby, and Ferdinand, posed in the schoolroom of their house, one critic emphasized its artifice and Oriental tone. He wrote, "The air, we feel, smells of scent and burnt pastille," which is French air fresheners or lozenges. "The moral atmosphere of an opulent and exotic society has been seized and put before us." Another writer went even further, saying that the children, variously and gaudily dressed, lie about among cushions like odalisks in a harem and are sprinkled over with dogs. There are actually 3 dogs in this painting, but so what? By the time he painted the Wertheimer portraits, Sargent was raising his prices. As I said, he had too many applicants for paintings, and he was hoping to discourage some of them, but it didn't work. His clients were wealthy enough that cost didn't matter. In 1900, he was charging £1,000 per portrait, which was about $5,000 $5,000 at the time. For 12 family portraits, Asher would have paid about 12,000 pounds, roughly $60,000 then, which is equal to more than $2 million today. Yet that multiple, 60,000 now worth 2 million, is not really accurate for art, which tends to appreciate at far greater rates than the economists measure for an ordinary basket of goods. Asher paid about $2 million for 12 portraits in the early 20th century. In the early 21st, a number of Sargent's paintings have sold for more than $10 million each. An art critic friend of mine says Sargent's brush lived to play, which we see in his gorgeous application of paint, his elongation of Betty's right arm, his deep saturations of color and light. He plays with rich allusions to earlier masters in his portrait of Asher, also with Oriental tropes in the paintings of the three younger children and throughout the series. He played the Oriental theme to the hilt in this painting of another Wertheimer daughter, Almina, dressing her in a man's Turkish coat and a lush silk turban with slices, you can't really see, but there's slices of ripe melon at her feet. And she's holding an Indian sarod in completely the wrong position. You couldn't possibly play it like that. And when he did a second portrait of Ina in 1904, he devised another costume drama, Lark. She arrived at his studio late for the first sitting, with her scarf and coat flying out behind her, and he decided to paint her just like that, in full sail. The phrase in Italian and the title of the painting is A vele gonfie. Sargent was also working at the time on a portrait of the Marlborough family, the 9th Duke, his wealthy American wife of Vanderbilt, and their 2 young sons. They had posed in the soaring Great Hall of Blenheim Palace, the ancestral Marlborough property in Oxfordshire, and Sargent was completing the picture in his studio. For this very formal portrait, the Duke wore the ceremonial robe and plumed hat of the Most Noble Order of the Garter, the oldest and most senior honor in the British system. Only 24 people hold it at a time, all appointed by the king or queen, and almost all men. Between follow-up sittings in London, the Duke left his garter robe and hat in Sargent's studio. And the artist appropriated these potent symbols of aristocratic privilege, or improvised copies of them, in an artfully transgressive collaboration with Ina that transforms her into a dashing cavalier. Having appeared in a revealing white gown in the portrait with Betty 3 years earlier, Ina here is fully swathed in masculine black. Her face, as she looks back over her shoulder, laughing, again appears lit from within, and she makes the hat with its fancy ostrich feathers look feminine and stylish. These two paintings, oh no, sorry. Oops, sorry. Yeah, these two paintings highlight the dramatically shifting currents in British society around the turn of the 20th century, with much of the old guard in decline and new energies on the rise. Anyone who watched Downton Abbey knows knows how dramatically this was taking place. In Sargent's ceremonial stately painting of the Marlboroughs, the faces are as expressionless as the palace's architectural stone, except for the faintly smiling younger son on the right and one eager Blenheim spaniel. In sharp contrast, Sargent and the Anglo-Irish Ina conspired to play around with emblems of patrician entitlement and gender. There was a cartoon in Punch when this painting appeared at the Royal Academy. It was a caricature of the painting, and the caption was, "Call yourself a soldier, look at me." In full sail, Ina looks as vibrant and sparkling as the Marlboroughs appear flat and stale. Both A vele gonfie and the Marlborough family were shown in the 1905 exhibition at the Royal Academy. If anyone noticed that Ina and the Duke were wearing the same robe, none of the critics mentioned it. This portrait of Elegonfi was a wedding present from Asher to Ina when she married Robert Matthias, a businessman from Cologne, in 1905. They had 5 kids, and those were some of my best sources of information about this family. After Ina died in 1936, her husband found a packet of letters from Sargent that she had saved. He couldn't read them. Sargent's handwriting is impossible. When I started this project, I couldn't make it out at all, but slowly learned. It's like studying a new language, a complete mystery at first, easier as you go along. Matthias gave the letters to his eldest daughter, Diana, asking her if she thought Mummy had had an affair with Sargent. Diana couldn't read the letters either, but took them to her Aunt Betty, the one standing next to Ina in Sargent's 1901 double portrait. Betty also couldn't decipher the handwriting. When Diana asked about a possible affair between Sargent and Ina, Betty reportedly replied, "Don't be silly, darling. Everyone knew he was only interested in Venetian gondoliers." Wait a minute, I'm going to go back to Sargent here. Sorry. There's no evidence of Sargent having had a sexual relationship with anyone, male or female, although his interest definitely inclined toward men. He did beautiful drawings and paintings of nude men, which were rarely shown during his lifetime, and almost no nude women, although the female body has always been an essential subject for art. If the line about gondoliers indicates the Wertheimers' tolerant attitude on this question, it would help shed light on Sargent's ease with the family. An acquaintance of Henry James, who was a close friend of Sargent, once said that the novelist, quote, seemed to look at women rather as women looked at them. He went on, "Women look at women as persons. Men look at them as women. The quality of sex in women, which is their first and chief attraction to most men, was not their chief attraction to James, nor was it to Sargent." Like his Jewish friends, Sargent would never be one of us in aristocratic British society, although he knew and painted many of its members who celebrated his work and included it in the national collections. He remained, at his own insistence, an American abroad and a deeply private figure. A sexual interest in men would hardly have ruled out social acceptance in England in the Edwardian era. Yet in 1885, homosexual acts were defined as gross indecency under English law, punishable by 2 years in prison with or without hard labor. When they led to public scandal, as they did for Sargent's friend Oscar Wilde in 1895, the doors to countless closets shut tight. So I'm going to fast forward here to another image. There. Here's one of Sargent's letters to Ina. I'm going to leave it up for the next few minutes, see if you can make it out. Ina's daughter, Diana, apparently kept that packet of Sargent letters, and one of her granddaughters sold it through Sotheby's in 2003. When I learned about the sale, I wrote to a Sotheby's curator and asked if he might put me in touch with the buyer. He did. It was an American art dealer. I called him G.H. I wrote to him, explained my project, and asked if I could see the letters. He said he'd send me photocopies if I would transcribe the letters, and I realized that he, like just about everyone else, couldn't read them. By this time, I was reasonably fluent in Sargent's handwriting. I did read and transcribe the letters and sent G.H. my transcripts, and belatedly figured out that he was going to sell them with the letters. Too late. I didn't think there would be much of a market for them. Who besides me would want them? I considered making an offer, but expected he would jack up the price, knowing of my interest. There was no news about a sale for a few years. I asked the major Sargent dealer in New York who knew Mr. H if she'd heard anything about a sale. She said, "He's waiting for your book to come out," which, of course, made sense. More time went by. Then in 2022, I heard from another Sargent expert that a packet of the artist's letters were coming up for auction in Maine with transcripts. I looked at the auction house website, and sure enough, these were the letters from Sargent to Ina and my transcripts. I asked my New York dealer friend about GH again, since she'd said he was waiting till my book came out, and it turned out that he had died of COVID. His estate was selling the letters. I registered for the auction. Once the lot came up, I bid the floor price. Someone raised it by $500, which I matched. Then, no more bids. I got the letters. And this is one of them. A couple of weeks later, they arrived in glassine envelopes clipped into loose-leaf binders. Of course, I'd already read and transcribed them and had the texts, but holding the original documents in my hand, the physical conversation between Sargent and Ina was and still is an entirely different experience, thrilling, intimate, almost sacred. Also in the binders were my transcripts, my email correspondence with GH, and his 2003 correspondence with Sotheby's when he bought the letters, which included the price he had paid, more than I just had. Here is the letter. It says 31 Tite Street, which was his address, and Tuesday. He almost never dated his letters, which makes things very difficult for a biographer. Dear Mrs. Matthias, he writes, this was obviously after Ina was married, how can one explain to you and remain your friend and sincere well-wisher that lunching out is one of the things one dreads the most in a life beset with nightmares, especially at a season when there are only about 4 hours of, that's the end of this page, but it goes on, 4 hours of daylight. If I were blind or paralyzed, you would see me dropping in daily and enchanting you with my cheerful presence. That time may shortly come. But for the moment, I can still sit up and tint my little pictures, singing merrily the while. Was anybody able to read any of that? As I said earlier, Sargent was an astute witness to the dramatic social changes that were taking place on both sides of the Atlantic throughout his long career. And he portrayed the cast of characters with broader sympathies than many of the actors had. Being American may have sharpened his eye for the conflicts, although what interested him was not abstract history, but character, self-presentation, visual style. Illuminating the stage, he captured fading grandeur and fresh energies, the colors and the shadows, the dazzle and the unease of a world in radical flux. Thank you. What? Yes, she could. There's another complicating factor, which is that he often wrote, what? He often wrote in French, which was hopeless for me. Ina was fluent in French, but one of the Sargent experts could make out his handwriting in French, so I relied on her a lot.
Thank you so much for that great talk and presentation. I was curious about the name of the book, The Family Romance, which is such a family romance without the the, which is a Freudian term, of course.
It is, although I don't mean it in that sense. Mm-hmm. We had a hard time finding, my editor and I, a title for this. One of the Sargent experts suggested a fine romance, which has a nice echo, but that didn't seem quite right. And I had been thinking about a family portrait, and then somehow in a conversation we got those two bits together, family romance. So,
it is a kind of family romance, though. I mean, you get the feeling, having read your 3 books, you get the feeling that you could sort of feel your temperature towards each of the people you write about, and you seem to love the people in this book.
I did. I did. It was by far the most fun of the books I've written.
Can you talk about the differences between writing about people you adore? And did you know that going in?
No, you never know, I don't think. Either whether you're going to like them or, I mean, you have an instinct that draws you to the subject, but you find out so much as you go along. And I only knew Sargent in a kind of cameo way from the James book and the Morgan book. So I was really meeting him for the first time in depth. And his letters that was probably not the greatest example. They're delightful. He's very witty and an incredibly wonderful friend to young people, old people, people he's known forever, and people he just meets. He's just great. And could not stop painting. I mean, everywhere he went, he was working. He stopped doing portraits in 1907. He was really sick of it. And he wrote to a friend saying, no more Paul-traits, Paughtrais. He said, I abhor and abjure them and hope never to do another, especially of the upper classes. But he was not that old. And he just would do landscapes and charcoal portrait sketches and travel and paint the whole time, but not portraits.
You've sort of settled in this one period of history. Do you think you'll stick to that?
I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do next. It makes sense to stick to it in the sense that I know it pretty well now. I didn't deliberately decide to have all my subjects here. It was sort of each one happened in a different way, but it turned out they're all sort of Gilded Age America, Edwardian England, Americans who spend a fair amount of time abroad. So that just happened.
Some of your books have taken, the Morgan book took 15 years, right?
Yes.
And Alice James took, 5 years? Mm-hmm. And how about Family Romance?
Well, I had a full-time job when I started thinking about this book, and actually did get a contract. So and it was in a library, so I could do a lot of research because I had access to millions of books, and I could travel to England, where most of the material about Sargent and the Wertheimers was, but I couldn't write. So there were about 5 years when I was thinking about this and doing research about it, but not writing. And then when I got ready to write, I left that job, and sort of from 2017 to 23, I was writing. So about 6 years of writing. And some of that was the pandemic, which was not the worst thing in the world if you have to stay home and...
Well, we just had his excuse for not going out to lunch.
Yes, exactly.
You can see that the trepidation you must have in terms of choosing a subject, knowing that you'll be with them for that long.
Yes.
I mean, who knows? Who would think that you start a book and you'll be immersed in this character and his family and his friends and his mistresses and all of it for 15 years.
Right. You'd never do it if you knew that at the outset.
No, you'd never do it.
A friend of mine says they're like marriages, and
Are they like marriages?
well, another friend of mine who's a well-known biographer said, when I was having trouble with Alice James, he said, just remember you can kill her whenever you want.
That's not quite like a marriage.
So not quite like marriages.
That's very funny. One imagines cultural, I don't consider your books biographies exactly, because they seem to cover so much more than the individual they're centered on. They seem to be kind of ensemble biographies or something, which capture the era as much as any one individual. But is there much sleuthing about I love the story in this book that, of how you got the letters at auction. Is there much of that? I mean, in my imagination, I imagine biographers, going to old people's country houses and finding caches of letters in locked cabinets under beds and so forth.
As in a Henry James novel,
yes,
for instance.
exactly.
Yes, there is that element. And when I was working on Alice James, she had a crush on a man named Charles Appleton. And he was interested in a woman named Frances something else. I don't remember what her last name was. And I had very good friends in Boston who were old Boston, a really old, wonderful Boston family. And I was having dinner with them in Milton, outside of Boston. And I asked about this, Charles Appleton and Fanny. And one of the women said, Charles something Appleton was my great-grandfather. And I thought, oh, good. So now I know who to ask about this. And with Morgan, I had almost finished the book. I mean, I had a really solid draft, and I was rewriting it. And I had become he had a favorite daughter who I got to know. She was still alive. No, sorry. Her daughter was still alive. So it was his favorite granddaughter, and then she had a granddaughter. So I got to know, they lived in New York. The younger one, who was in her 40s by this time, and the granddaughter, who was in her upper 80s. The older woman died, and the youngest one called me and said, I think you better get over here. I just opened a closet that we never looked in before, and it's full of letters.
Wow.
Yeah, and it was from his favorite daughter, who was the direct line in this family, who he traveled with all the time, and who was writing home about it to her mother and her brother and friends, and who, one of the funny things and difficult things about writing about someone as wealthy and powerful as Morgan is that bends the sight lines. People are always trying to position themselves in relation to someone with that much power and wealth, and either to sort of ingratiate themselves with him and flatter him as they write about their time with him, or to knock him dead, to criticize him and show how much smarter and more superior they are. So you have to be correcting for that all the time. And it was a really big problem, not so much with the Jameses and not so much with Sargent. But his daughter didn't need anything from him. She had his affection, she had plenty of wealth, and so she was really commenting on what was happening. And it was a much more honest appraisal and just invaluable. So I had to sort of stop and read all those letters and then sort of fit them in wherever they.
And you've talked about your own feelings towards Morgan as a character or as a person changing in the course of the 15 years you were working on the piece. Can you talk about that a little? It's so interesting.
Well, it's a long story, but the short version is that I had gone after Alice James, who was a neurasthenic invalid, and people kept suggesting to me new subjects about the daughters and the wives and the sisters of famous men. And I just thought, I wrote that book. I don't want to do that again. I was looking for a bad guy. And at dinner one night, a friend said robber barons, which was right in my period of the late 19th century, the Gilded Age. And I thought, oh, and it was a long sequence, but I ended up choosing Morgan, knowing nothing about finance or him or art collecting, which he did hugely. But I definitely went in thinking I was writing about a bad guy, and I wrote a draft of it. I was just prosecuting him, and I sent the draft to a very smart friend of mine. I quote a lot, especially in early drafts or something when I'm trying to figure out what I think. And so this friend of mine had all these quotes of the material I was reading, and he read it and he said, "You're not listening to him. He's much more open and meritocratic and flexible than you're giving him credit for." And I had to really rethink all of my responses. And I had come in with every left liberal female intellectual prejudice you could have about a man like this. And I didn't end up thinking he was a great saint or hero, but I think he did really important things. And I mean, he was basically the Federal Reserve when we didn't have one, and was sort of raising American capital in Europe to build first railroads and then the American infrastructure. I mean, he organized the creation of U.S. Steel, International Harvester, General Electric, and the modern form of AT&T. We might not think those are good things, but it really did establish 20th century America.
Yeah.
So.
And do you keep notebooks of potential people or groups that you might?
No, it's just in my head. I mean, I was thinking I'm not sure I certainly don't want to write another big book. I'd like to find something that's as much fun as the Sargent book was and short. But I thought maybe I should just look through the indexes of all three of the books and see if somebody kind of jumps
See
out.
if there's a minor character
Yeah.
who just sort of jumps out. That sounds like a lot of fun. I know that in fiction, writing about real people, there are all kinds of moral concerns that we all have as novelists or short story writers. How does that translate to a biography or to historical, cultural, the kind of books you do?
Tell me a little more what you mean. If reading real people is, in other words, there's a model for your fiction, and you think what?
Well,
think
I
when they
was
read
even
this?
thinking about sometimes like historical figures, like for example, Dr. O wrote about the Rosenbergs, or
Yeah.
something. And it's always interesting if there's some question of,
Is this
what are your obligations to the real people, even if they're dead?
right?
And how do you are there those sorts of issues in biography? I imagine there are.
Yeah. The Dr. O is a good example, and also Gore Vidal's Lincoln. When I finished reading that book, which is fantastic, I thought I just read a biography of Lincoln, but I hadn't. It was fiction, and
Wow.
it's really
Yeah.
very tricky. It's a good problem. Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, you just immerse yourself in the evidence, and you sort of, it's almost like a hologram. There's this thing at the center that's not really there, and you're trying to get all these different perspectives to make it a visible thing. But I guess it's just a question of trying to be as honest with yourself as possible about this, and with your readers about what you find and who you reconstruct this person to have been. But there aren't a lot of you sort of have to check all the way along, because a new letter could come along
Right.
that totally changes what you
Your
wrote,
opinion,
what you
yeah.
thought. Yeah.
And it's interesting because I imagine you have to check both ways. Like you fell in you seem to love everybody in this book. It's just and I do as a reader. They're incredibly appealing. So you probably have to check that too. You want to be accurate.
Yeah.
In the face of your own infatuations as well.
Yes.
That's
But
really
it's a more fun problem to have than the other.
Yes, much better. Yeah, you were saying that Alice could frustrate you
Yes.
at times. I found her so I didn't feel she was frustrating.
Good.
I could go on talking forever, but I know the audience is going to have a lot of questions. So if you could raise your hand, and there are microphones, people will come to you. We have wonderful ushers here.
Shall I go? Sargent's reputation has seemed to kind of vacillate between whether he should be regarded as essentially a conservative figure, a zag, or that there's a subversive element in his work that, makes him more of a zig, I guess. And I'm just curious, in reading his letters and kind of getting to know him sort of personally, do you have a sense of how he viewed himself in that regard? Did he think of himself as like throwing in all sorts of subversive elements even as he's doing portraits for wealthy people, or did he feel like he was sort of a protector of a tradition?
I think the former. Certainly he was in the tradition of great portrait painters of the past. He was not, he was alive when Picasso and Matisse and Braque started painting real modernism, and he was not interested in that, which is, to many people's minds, a great flaw. And I'll talk in a minute about what happened to his reputation in the 20th century. But I think he was subversive in some ways, and especially in these Wertheimer pictures, playing around with the accepted tropes of and referring to earlier masters, but doing something of his own with them. Sort of giving, if you look at other portraits from that time next to Sargent's portraits, some of them, Whistler's are fantastic, but many of them are just flat and dead, and these just jump off the canvas at you. So he was doing something that really gave life to his characters. And I think also that what I mentioned in my talk about this drama of social change, I think that was a commentary at the same. People think if you're being paid to paint someone's portrait, you're going to flatter them. You're just going to make them look good. But he didn't. Lots of people hated, they destroyed their portraits. They really hated them. He was not a flatterer. And I think it makes the paintings much better, much more imaginative and real. Anyway. So he, partly because he was so uninterested in modernism and in the painters who were changing the whole history of art, and he stopped doing portraits, and then World War I came along, and then the Depression, and then World War II, and his reputation just tanked over starting when he was still alive. Some people were hugely critical of him for painting portraits of rich people, although he was doing lots of other things besides that. And for most of the 20th century, he wasn't shown. It's hard to imagine because he's so popular now, more in America than in Europe, but he was, for 40, 50 years, there were no shows of his work. And then it began to come back in the 1990s. There's an art critic named Hilton Kramer who wrote in the 1990s, he said, "It's time to forgive Sargent for making it big in the 1880s."
Hilton Kramer, deliberately conservative art critic.
Yes.
So there is an element of politics and how to take them on.
Yes, but I still think that was an accurate observation.
That's fun.
Hello, I have right here, in the back. A couple questions. One is from one of his self-portrait, you mentioned he is a very private and guarded person. So I'm curious about, were you able to detect more of his personality through the letters he wrote to Ina? And the second question, I'm curious about, how did the idea of this book come to you?
I did get more of a sense of his personality through the letters, not just to Ina, but to everybody. He wrote a lot of letters. He had many good, especially female friends, Isabella Stewart Gardner and Lady Elizabeth Lewis, who was also Jewish. He just becomes a very three-dimensional character in those letters. So those self-portraits, he's really retreating from revealing himself, but he's never really, he's very, very private anyway, but you get a flavor of his character. I saw these paintings for the first time in Seattle, sort of by accident. I never had heard of them. I was doing some work in Seattle, and the Seattle Art Museum had a Sargent show, and I knew, this was in 2001, I knew his work, partly from the James book and the Morgan book, and just there are lots of his works around Boston, where I've spent a lot of time. So I went to see a Sargent show, and it turned out it was these portraits. And as I said a little while ago, I was completely taken by surprise because I so thought of him as painting European aristocrats and Boston Brahmins, not Jews. And there were photographs in this exhibition. There were photographs that showed he was playing croquet on the lawn at their country house with them, and there were lots of drawings of the Wertheimers that he had signed with sort of jokey references and stuff. So clearly, this was a very strong friendship, and I was quite intrigued. I wasn't looking to write a new book, but I bought the catalog. I went back to New York. I took a full-time job, but it didn't let me alone, so.
Excuse me, one minute. I'm sorry. We taped these, so let's get you a microphone, if we can.
Yes.
Hello, thank you. You mentioned that 10 of the 12 portraits were given in a bequest to the British state and are in the Tate collection now, but 2 of them are in the United States.
Correct.
I was curious, do you know how they, I feel bad for these 2 paintings that aren't with the family, and how they came to be in like the Smithsonian and New Orleans collections.
Good. You're very knowledgeable about this. The first one of Mrs. Sargent, Flora, they didn't like, as I said, and she gave it to one of her daughters, and that daughter sold it, and it ended up bought by someone who gave it to the New Orleans Museum of Art.
And they didn't like it because she looked too rich?
Well, she thought that's what her descendants said, and
He couldn't have like revised it the way he revised the strap and whited out one strand of pearls or something?
I don't think so. I mean, this brings up another interesting question, which was that there was a wonderful show about Sargent and fashion a few years ago in Boston, and he very much curated what people wore for the portraits. I mean, someone would show up in an outfit and he'd say, no, we're not doing that. Go home and bring back some other ones. Or he had some in his studio. So he chose how he wanted them portrayed. So I don't know whether Mrs. Wertheimer wore that outfit or he asked for it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if that's true about looking too rich, but that's what her descendants thought. And I mean, it's a beautiful portrait, but the next one, which is so dark and sad.
More emotional.
Yeah,
More
and
evocative.
it's sort of a better match with the one of Asher. So, does that answer the question? Oh, sorry, the Smithsonian one. Yes, I knew I was forgetting half of it. He did, it's in my slide deck, I think, but I'm not going to share it with you now. He did a later portrait of Betty, the younger daughter, in the Ina and Betty, and it's not very interesting. She's wearing a red low-cut gown again, posed outside. It sort of looks like a fake French 17th, 18th century pose, but it's just wooden. It just doesn't work. So she ended up owning that, and she too ended up selling it to somebody who ultimately gave it to the Smithsonian. Or it may have gone through 3 or 4 owners, but it did go. A shocking thing, which it's a long story again, but Ina sold Avella Gonfier, that wonderful one of her, which was their collaboration. She opened an art gallery of her own with modern artists. And I think she probably did it to raise money for that, but she didn't tell her husband, who supposedly it was a wedding gift to both of them. He was absolutely furious. And they fought over it. There were lawyers. They probably spent more on lawyers than she got for the painting. After she died, he managed to buy it back. It went to Charles Deering, an American who was a very good friend of Sargent's and owned a lot of them and gave a lot of them to the Art Institute of Chicago. And her husband bought it back, so it's now at the Tate with all the others.
Let's make sure the lady in the hat gets a microphone. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So I am familiar with the scandal of Madame X at the time, and your other books seem to have been about titans in some way. I'm curious if you would ever consider writing about a character like Madame X who is ancillary to somebody much bigger story.
Well, Alice James definitely was that. I mean, she was the sister of a famous novelist and a famous philosopher psychologist. Do you have someone in mind? Madame X? There are books about her. Yeah.
There's one over here.
How long? Hi.
Hi,
Hey,
Bennett.
Jeannie. How long would these sittings last? And what was the general environment? I know he mentioned in the letter that he's whistling to her or singing a song, or like what is, are they having conversations? Is it deep or is it silence? And
It varied. depending on how close and affectionate he was with someone. And some he did fairly quickly. Some of the best ones he did fairly quickly. And some took just multiple sittings, and he hated it, and they hated it. So I think the one of Ina avec les Gonfis was probably did not take very long. Yeah, and he did, people described him, he would place the sitter and the canvas fairly near to each other, and then he would walk way back and sort of get the picture in his eye of what he wanted to do, and then he would dash forward and dab at the canvas, and then back up again and do it again. And when they do cleaning and deep examinations of the canvases, they find, I mean, this is probably true for a lot of artists, but there are lots of bristles of brush bristles embedded deep in the paint, partly from that attack. I mean, probably a lot of artists do work that way, but his was singularly a lot of movement in it. And he did have a piano in the studio, and people do talk a lot about his sort of taking a break and humming and playing a tune or walking around.
Thanks. Thanks for being here, both of you, and your candor. Hey, a writing question. What's the hardest part of the process for you, the biggest challenge, and how do you address it?
Good question.
It is a good question. I would say, I think you should answer this too, with fiction, but I think it's probably different for each project. I mean, with Morgan, I didn't know anything about finance. That was a hugely hard challenge. And I came in prosecuting him, and I had to open myself up to change my mind. So I would say there were more challenges in that book than in the other two. With Alice James, I mean, she was so difficult, and just taking to her bed with the vapors rather than pulling up her socks and doing something. I had a very hard emotional time accepting that was the story of her life, that it wasn't going to get any better. So it really varies with each project. Do you find you could answer that about fiction?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There's always moments when you, yes, exactly. I'm so in the head of Sargent and the Wertheimers, it's hard to even think about writing at the moment. But I wanted to ask you a question. I know he was very close to Henry James, and I love Alan Gurganus's novella, which is based on Sargent. What other works have used Sargent, and has anyone else used Sargent and any of his sitters as characters in
That's a good
fiction?
question. Well, there have been.
I know there are movies, right?
There are movies, and there is a ballet about Madame X, and maybe an opera too. That's a good question about fiction. Let me think about that. Nothing that springs to mind.
Thank you. I would like that. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I see there's one in the back.
Do you have one?
There's one in the back, but she needs a microphone. Thank you.
Yes, hi, thank you. It's been really lovely. I'm curious how writing about an artist actually gave you another visual point or creative intake and take. How did that change you, if at all? But
I think it probably did, because I had I had written about Morgan as a collector, but not about an actual artist. So yes, I had to learn a lot, and it certainly made me look at art in different ways and think about it in different ways. So yeah.
Did you?
There's someone up in the front who has it.
My question is not nearly as this might be of interest. What did you learn of Sargent's romantic life as you were researching this book? Because there seems to be such a dearth of information. I've seen 2 major exhibits, and I wonder, you know.
Everyone wonders. There's no answer. I mean, there's a very interesting book called Sargent the Sensualist that came out in about '99 by Trevor Fairbrother, who's a really serious Sargent scholar, who is himself gay, and he was examining that whole question and completely convincingly shows how much that was his Sargent's sensibility. But we don't know anything about an actual relationship, which is very frustrating. And he may not have had one. It's hard to believe. I mean, we think most people do. We just don't know about them. But if he did, no one has found anything. I mean, that could change. There could be some letters that suddenly surface, but it hasn't happened.
There was no exchange between he and any of the Wertheimers that led you to believe that
No. I mean,
closest friends, maybe he was less guarded?
no.
People that,
There you go.
sometimes, are there any people who were much, much less characters that were perhaps servants or perhaps even lower than servants who attended to Sargent? And are there any of those relatives living that has anyone interviewed them? Because sometimes I found those are the people who have the most information rather than their grand friends are reluctant to give that information.
Right. I think that's
And there
very close.
Wasn't there a male?
Yes, he had a sort of valet manservant with whom he lived and traveled for a very long time. So far, I don't think anybody has found evidence that that was a sexual relationship. But again, how would you know if there's not a written document about it or someone?
And given the danger, there was probably the equivalent of an NDA, you know.
Yeah. I mean, there was gossip, but it's often from people who were very envious of him. So was it accurate or not? It's just really hard to know. There's a new book coming about him in this spring that claims to have information about his sexuality that we haven't known before. I'll be interested
Have you
to
seen
see.
a galley?
Huh?
Have you seen a galley
No.
or anything? That's one you should review. We're talking about you reviewing books.
Right.
We have time for one more question, and then Jean is going to sign some books for us afterwards.
Maybe we've exhausted.
I had a question about your process. So as you are writing a biography, and you're kind of, in a way, painting a portrait of this person, and you're doing all this research, how do you know when you're done?
Good question.
They die. I mean, then of course you go back and have to fix things and stuff, but there is that birth to death structure, which interestingly was not there for the Wertheimer Sargent book, because it's not one life, birth to death. It's a whole collection of people, so it was a very different question. So I was slightly joking when I said they die, although that is an endpoint for part of the story. But you know, you could go on revising forever. It helps to have an editor who says, okay, that's enough. I think at a certain point, you know, you have to just let it go. But yeah, I think you just have to feel it and let them die.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
And Jean will be signing books right over here.